Chief Operating Officer, Deputy Director General Research for Sustainable Production Systems and Integrated Programs, and Director of the Integrated Development Program. Dr. Govers, the floor is yours.
Isabel, and thanks everybody, and welcome to this seminar. I know we are all very busy, but like they say, when you're too busy, it's time to take a pause. Welcome to this seminar, and I'm very happy to introduce Gideon, speaker of today, with a very interesting topic, which is called research ethics, compliance, why, who, and how. And I think this refers to CIMMYT's core value, that we want to have excellence in research, and that means excellence in our research outcomes, in our research outputs, but also excellence in the way we do research, which more and more includes elements of ethics and ethical compliance. And therefore, this seminar could not come more timely. I know you all know Gideon, because I think he's omnipresent today in all the initiatives, making the Ex-ante work, but also supporting many teams with data and data-driven decisions. So all the more, Gideon, thanks for taking the time to make this seminar to the overall CIMMYT community. Gideon leads the Foresight and targeting team in CIMMYT, including ex-ante impact assessments, and of course, is supported in that capacity the MAIZE and WHEAT CRPs. As you all know, it can take between 10 and 25 years before the impact of the research started today is actually seen in the farmer's field. So if we concentrate on today's issues and start working on those solutions, when those solutions are available, we may actually have solutions to yesterday's problems. So that's why Gideon is actually making it his life goal to look at challenges like climate change, new emerging pests and diseases, dietary changes, rural transformation, and disruptive technologies. So he can paint us a future, and from that future, we can then work back and actually provide solutions to that future. Gideon holds a doctorate in development economics for the Wageningen University and has worked for the CGIAR, the academia, national agriculture research systems, and non-governmental organizations. He's an expert at complex modeling, especially using GANs, and I have no idea what that is, Gideon, so at some point you may give a seminar on that. And R, which I'm very familiar with, but at some point you may also want to give a seminar on that. And he leads the community of practice and socio-economic data in the CGIAR platform for big data in agriculture. Kruseman is also the chair of CIMMYT's Institutional Ethics in Research Committee, and that is what today's seminar is about. Over to you, Gideon, and the best of luck. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Bram, for this nice introduction. So yes, the talk of today is on research ethics compliance: why, who, and how. So what will I talk about in this seminar today? I will give a little bit of the context, why we have this issue of ethics approval of research activities. We'll talk about who should be aware that research needs to have ethics clearance. We'll go a little bit into whether location matters or not for where the research takes place, and then how a researcher, a PI, or a project leader can get research activities cleared. And then if you go into that process of research ethics clearance, what do you need to consider, and who is involved in this process? There will be a Q&A afterwards, so yeah, just please put your questions in the chat. So the context. So why would we need to have ethics research review in the first place? First of all, as Bram said, what we're doing is about scientific excellence and doing this in a responsible way. So doing things ethically is the right thing to do. Independent of everything else, it's something that we should be doing because it's a core value of CIMMYT. But in terms of, let's say, the more practical reasons why this is there is, well, we have a CIMMYT policy. The first CIMMYT policy, which put in place a research ethics committee to review and approve research activities, came into place in 2016. From 2017 onwards, we've had the Institutional Research Ethics Committee in place. The policy was updated in 2019. You can find it on the website, and it's available for everyone in the world to see. You can just reach it through the CIMMYT website. But it's not just CIMMYT. It's part of the whole CGIAR. The CGIAR has a research ethics code. The latest version of this was approved by the CGIAR system board in late 2020. So this is quite recent, and it lays out the foundation across the system of research ethics. This research ethics code is a little bit more broad than the topics that we cover within IREC, but IREC is definitely part of the research ethics code of CGIAR. The fundamental basis under ethical principles for research is in the Belmont report, which was which was put in place in the mid-1970s in the U.S. That is the foundational work on research ethics, which was followed up by the Helsinki protocol, which was focused very much on medical issues. The Belmont report is a little bit broader than biomedical research. I'll get back to that a little bit later, but it's not just those types of things that come into play. There is also the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and many of the countries where we operate are signatory to this declaration, this treaty, and that means that we need to take into consideration the rights of indigenous people when we do research, and the issues that come into play there are sometimes different than when you would do research with someone who is not an indigenous, doesn't belong to an indigenous people's group. So these are all considerations. Now, finally, there is one which some of you have undoubtedly run into, because I know that some of the people who I saw on the participants list have reached out to us on this. Is the fact that journals require proof of ethics approval of when you try to get a manuscript published that uses primary data that involves human subjects. And so this is, if you do a questionnaire, ask people stuff, or a focus group discussion or whatever, and I'll get into the whole range of issues that the types of research that that would require this type of approval a little bit later, but the journals are requiring proof. And if you haven't gone through ethics approval, you cannot get your research published. And, that is a big deal if you're a scientist. So that is a final, really that's something that comes down really hard to the core of what you do as a scientist. So location, does location matter? Yes, it does. Different countries have different laws, rules, and regulations governing human subjects research. So I mentioned that the basis of ethics review is in the biomedical research, where you can imagine, if you're doing medical research and you're doing treatments on patients, that there are severe ethical implications there. That was the basis for getting these kind of rules and regulations in place. So a lot of countries have laws, rules, and regulations in place for biomedical research, which means that that part is covered almost everywhere. Other types of human subjects research and socio-economic research, but also participatory research in the agricultural sciences is not always covered by those laws. So there is a difference there, and in some countries have very strict laws, others are less strict. So, for instance, a country like Kenya, where we do a lot of research, and a country like Uganda, where we do a little bit less but still do research. All social science research has to go through a local research ethics review process with a locally registered IRB. In most of the countries where we operate, they do not require local clearance, and that's where the work of IREC comes in to clear that type of research. So it's not only on the research itself. There is also laws, rules, and regulations regarding privacy and data confidentiality. Many of you have heard of the GDPR in Europe, which governs the way that you handle data belonging to about and belonging to human subjects. Those kind of laws exist in many countries. And some of them are way more strict than the GDPR, at least in certain aspects. And those are really important things to take into consideration. And the interesting part here is that what is required in one country as something that you need to do with data can be prohibited in another country. So it's something that you need to take into consideration very carefully. And then finally, different funders have specific requirements related to research ethics, which are parts of the contracts that we have related to the project. So if a funder has very specific requirements with regard to research ethics, then that is something that we need to take into consideration. And finally, going back to the Treaty on Indigenous People, I mentioned that many of the countries where we work are signatory to this. The implementation rules on the treaty is something that is done at the national level, and therefore we need to take into consideration the national legislation regarding the rights of indigenous people. when we do research. Now, this is why we don't expect all our researchers to be aware of all legislation and all rules and regulations in every country in the world, and that's where the IREC comes in terms of checking some of these issues prior to the implementation of research activities. So, who needs to ensure that their research activities go through ethics review? You can imagine already, some of the things that we've mentioned. The typical CIMMYT research requiring ethics approval that everyone will think of is the kind of social science research or research very close to social science. When you do surveys, focus group discussions, market study, things like that, involving people, then you need to get ethics approval for those research activities. But it's also about things like on-farm trials, because you are working with farmers or with their assets, and that also requires ethics approval, especially when you're dealing with the use of machinery or with hazardous chemicals, and then definitely ethics. There are ethics issues that need to be addressed. Other things that you may not think about, which require some level of ethics scrutiny, is participatory variety selection. Because again, you're dealing with people, you're doing research. It requires ethics clearance. Research activities that you do during demonstration events. And so you have a demonstration event, but you're asking people questions about what they think. That at that point you're doing research with people, and that means that activity requires ethics clearance. Very often these are really easy, very low risk type research activities that get cleared really quickly. And so it's not a really a big deal, but you need to take it into consideration. Another issue that people will not realize always is that taking pictures of people in general has ethical implications. And it really means that you need to get permission, and you need to inform people what the pictures are going to be used for, and if there are any risks for them involved if that happens. Clearance is always needed in a number of cases. So obviously, biomedical research and things that are closely linked to biomedical research. So research activities involving health and nutrition, especially if there is blood sampling or anthropometric measurements taking place. Clearance is needed, big time. And it's something that is in the legislation of almost every country in the world, that you need to get ethics clearance for that. Other types of clearance where clearance is always needed is when there is some level of deception involved in the research. For instance, when you're doing research in the mystery shopper type research, where you go into shops or into marketplaces, collect samples, make observations of what is happening there, and the people that are involved in this, the people in the market, the shopkeepers, are not aware that they are subject of a research activity, then that definitely requires very careful ethical scrutiny. Another issue that you need to take into consideration is that all research that involves personally identifiable information needs ethics clearance. So this is when you're collecting people's direct personally identifiable information, or PII, such as names and telephone numbers, even if it is for such benign purposes as being able to follow up with a respondent in order to check an answer, or to come back to a person in case of a follow-up, then it's personally identifiable information, and it falls under the purview of research ethics clearance. But it's not just the direct PII, such as names and telephone numbers and any other things like, social security numbers, whatever, but it's also the indirect PII. Things like household roster information about what is the household composition like in some level of detail, where you say, okay, the head of the household is a male and he is 46 years old. He has a wife who is 43 years old. They have there is 6 children in the house, but of this and this age and this gender. Okay, this kind of information can be used to re-identify a household which in any other way is anonymized. So this kind of indirect PII can be extremely sensitive, and collecting that kind of information requires ethics clearance. The other one is granular geospatial information. So when you collect geospatial information on homesteads or farmers' fields, then those research activities and the data that is being collected needs to be approved on ethics grounds. So this is, in a nutshell, the wide variety of research activities that require research ethics, which is a lot of the stuff that we do at CIMMYT. What doesn't fall under this is the breeding activities on station. That definitely, no, that's stuff that doesn't need ethics clearance. Not from our. There might be other types of clearance that are needed for it because you're dealing with genetic material, but not the ethics clearance that the IREC is responsible for. So, if you are a principal investigator, and you've just seen a type of research come by in this presentation that is remotely similar to the type of things that you do, then you might be wondering, how can I get my research activities reviewed and approved by the IREC? Well, let's start with the key elements that are needed for an ethical research activities. The really important one is prior informed consent. If you're dealing with people in your research activity, you have to give the people the possibility to say no. So you need to get their informed consent to participate in a research activity, and that whole procedure for getting prior informed consent has a number of different components, for which I won't go into in detail now, because I want to have some time for questions and answers later on. you know, it's fairly straightforward. We have guidelines and templates for how to set up a prior informed consent procedure, but it's really important. It's also the part where when you're taking pictures of people, that you need to get their prior informed consent, and that those pictures are that you can take those pictures and use them for certain purposes. And if people give you consent for something, then that is what it is that you can use their data or their pictures or whatever for that purpose. So you have to think ahead of time what that information is going to be used for, because you cannot go beyond the scope of what you're asking the data for. So, you know, one way of doing it when you're collecting data for research purposes, and it's a little bit, there is no real reason to limit the scope tremendously, then providing that kind of a broad scope of doing this for research by CIMMYT researchers and their partners is one way of addressing that. The prior informed consent is one part. There always has to be a balance between the discomforts of participating in a research activities and the benefits related to participating in the research activity. Those benefits can be, you know, quite indirect in the sense that there is the possibility that the research leads to improved productivity, etc., which will be beneficial to the farmer involved, etc., etc. But sometimes you have real discomforts. For instance, if you're doing a survey that takes 3 hours in total, maybe in multiple sessions, then that is a discomfort to the person, and you have to be very clear about those discomforts. The third aspect, which is key to ethics review, is the management of risk. Are there risks involved in the research? Many of the research that we do at CIMMYT is what we call low risk. There are not that big risks involved. But sometimes, if you're asking sensitive questions, perhaps something around gender relations in societies where this is a taboo topic, then there are risks involved in terms of that kind of information if people know that you've even talked to people about those kind of things, or if the information can be linked back to, for instance, a community. Might already pose a risk to the people involved. Another type of risk is the one that I mentioned earlier when I was talking about on-farm trials and the more technical type of research activities. If you're working with machinery or with hazardous chemicals, then if that is part of work with farmers or with local service providers that are using machinery or agrochemicals, then there is a risk involved that needs to be mitigated and becomes part of the ethics review process. Finally, what is really important, linked to data privacy and data confidentiality, is a responsible data management especially related to personally identifiable information, whether it's direct or indirect personally identifiable information or granular geospatial information. So these are the key elements of ethical research activities. So if you want, if you want to get your research activities approved by IREC, then what kind of documentation would you need to get that done? So one is a cover sheet with some key administrative information, like what project is this part of, in which country is it taking place. If you go back to what I said earlier, it matters where, in what context the research takes place, who the funder is. If we need to check whether there are special circumstances in the contract related to ethics, or if the research takes place in certain countries which have legislation in place regarding research ethics or privacy and data confidentiality, things like that. We need to be able to check that, and that's the key part of that administrative information. The second really important piece of documentation that we need is a research protocol. A research protocol describes why you're doing the research, what you're doing, the places that you're doing, the time, how you're recruiting people to participate, etc., etc. So we have templates for writing a research protocol, and very often it is just cut and paste from project documents. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a lot of work to set up that kind of a research protocol. What is really important is to spell out the prior informed consent procedure, because that is a crucial part of the ethical research implementation. So that's something that we really look at. What does the prior informed consent procedure look like, and is it appropriate for the type of research that is being done? You can imagine that if you're doing high-risk research, that you will be the prior informed consent procedure needs to be more elaborate than in the case where it's a really small, it's low risk research, where, for instance, you're asking people on a market what kind of seeds they have just purchased and why, and the kind of motivation there. You're not collecting any names or telephone numbers or where the village where they came from, but you're just capturing that kind of information. There, the prior informed consent procedure can be really rapid, in contrast to what the other example that I gave earlier. Another thing that needs to come with any as a documentation with any research activity submission for ethics review is any and all of the research instruments. So that includes all the questionnaires, the questions that will be asked in focus group discussions, or the topics that will be breached. If it is a less structured interview, then what the scope is of the interview. In the case of on-farm trials, the basic parameters related to that trial that are of ethics relevance and of relevance to the participating farmer. And so those are your research instruments, and you need to provide that kind of information. So how can you do this? So one of the ways that you can do it is you can just contact the IREC and ask for help. Some of our scientists who've been doing this for many years already know how to write a research protocol and get all the relevant information. They'd usually just send it to us. Over the last year or so, we've developed some online forums which will allow our scientists to fill in all the information online, and that to start that process. There are also some templates and guidelines for preparing research protocols for the prior informed consent procedures. We have plenty of examples that were developed by the CIMMYT researchers doing field work with human subjects. So you're not starting from scratch. A lot of it is already there, and there's quite a few resources available. One of the things that I haven't mentioned yet, and which is important, is that we have an institutional subscription to the city program for ethics training. It's one of the internationally renowned online ethics training institutes. We have some guidelines on how to register as a CIMMYT scientist, and you can do your training there. The training is not focused on agricultural research. So while it makes a lot of sense for social scientists to follow, the examples are very far from, for instance, an agronomist doing on-farm trials. Let me introduce you to our research ethics committee. We recently expanded the IREC earlier this year, so we now have members from all the different programs in the IREC. I chair the committee. I was appointed in 2017 by the DG, and I have, even though I'm extremely busy with a lot of other things, I have, while we move towards one CGIAR, and once that's in place, it will become more clear how the research ethics will continue in one CGIAR. I will continue until that time as chair of the IREC. Then we have a member from each of the programs. From IDP, there's actually 2 members because we basically have the members from the original IDP as well as from the socio-economics program that was merged into IDP. Then we have a member from the legal unit who addresses all these kind of legal and contractual issues related to ethics clearance. And we have an external member who is who we need when we have more high-risk research activities that need the review of the full committee. In most of the research activities that we conduct at CIMMYT, it's enough that a member who is not a member of the same program reviews the research and approves it, along with the opinion of the legal unit in terms of addressing any contractual or legal issues. Sometimes we will have two members look at it, and it's only in very rare cases that the full committee needs to review and assess an activity. So before we move into the Q&A, let me quickly give you some resources that are available for the researchers who are who need to get their research activities reviewed. There is a page on Inside CIMMYT under the heading of the committees. The Research Ethics Committees has its own page on Inside CIMMYT, and there is a lot of resources there, including the link to the online form to submit your research activities for review. You can always send an email to myself or one of the other members of the IREC, as well as to the CIMMYT IREC email. The CIMMYT IREC has its own email account where you can go send emails with questions, with requests, etc. That's what I had prepared, and looking forward to your questions.
Thank you. I'm sorry. Thank you, Gideon, for this wonderful presentation. We have two questions in the chat box. One says, does CIMMYT provide a specific guideline on data anonymization process? Sorry. For example, geo-coordinate for a farmer field from when survey data has been collected should be truncated up to how many decimal points?
Yeah, okay, that's a really good question. It's context specific. So in most of the contexts where we work, truncated it to 2 decimal places is sufficient, because it then points to a general area and no longer to an individual household. But it really is context specific. So if you're doing research in an area where farms are spread wide apart, and even if you do it at a 2 decimal point, you would be pointing to maybe 1 or 2 farms, then that's not sufficient blurring of the data. An example which is not so relevant for our own research, since we do not do research in the US, but you can imagine, you know, if you do the research in the Midwest in the US, going down to 1 decimal point may even point you to a single farm. And so it's really context specific how to what level you need to blur your geospatial information.
Thank you. We have another question. When we collect data through local partners, the prior consent is handled by us or by the partners?
Well, if we do when we do research as CIMMYT, where we are involved in the research process, then we have a responsibility for the research ethics. So you have to ensure that a prior informed consent procedure is in place, but in terms of the implementation, and because I'm not completely sure what the question is driving at, in terms of the implementation, if you have we have a local implementation partner who is doing the interviews for us, then they will be the ones who will be getting the prior informed consent. The prior informed consent procedure itself is cleared by IREC and is implemented through our partners. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. What are the steps that we have to follow to get the IREC clearance once we submitted the clearance request? How long it will take for clearance, since we have to conduct periodic surveys required for the report, either semi or annual report, that mandatory for donor reporting. And most of those data are not published in the scientific journals. Also, these type surveys, which mostly ends after reporting, should we have to take them for clearance as well?
Yeah. Well, in principle, you need to get clearance for all the research activities that you do with human subjects, human subjects. So even if the information that you collect is not used for scientific publications, but only for internal reporting, you still need to get the clearance. I mentioned the fact that you need to get clearance for you need to have clearance if you want to publish in scientific journals as one of the elements that comes into play, and why it's important. But when we collect information from farmers or other people for research purposes, you need to get those activities cleared. If you're doing periodic data collection and the procedure is well defined ahead of time, then we can actually, you can get the whole range of those data collection activities or sub-activities cleared in one go. However, you need to keep in mind that a research ethics clearance is valid for 1 year. So if you have an activity that extends beyond a year, or for some reason, like for COVID, you got clearance for an activity, but it was then delayed due to COVID, and then a year later you do it again, you need to get that activity cleared again. However, if it was cleared initially and nothing substantial has changed other than the date on which the research takes place, then the clearance of the research activity can be very fast. So the question that was part of this is how long these kind of things take. Well, that depends. I mean, if the researcher submits all the documentation and everything is completely in order, everything is okay, and there is no major, it's a low risk type research, the turnaround time can be as low as 2 or 3 days. However, if you're new to the process, you haven't done this before, it's very likely that the first time that you submit your research activity, there are issues that you haven't thought of or haven't completely understood what needs to be done. So it'll take a little while to a little bit more time of a bit of back and forth to get your research activity into the shape that it can be approved. For instance, a prior informed consent procedure that may be missing some key elements, or you have kind of questions. Oh, I'm trying to do this. Can that be done? What do I need to do? These kind of things. That kind of back and forth also takes time. Depending on the country where the research takes place, we may need to do some checking on what the current legal requirements are with respect to ethics review. And in some cases, you will need to get ethics review by a locally registered research ethics body, and while that means that IREC does not necessarily have to be involved in it, it certainly makes sense to get your pre-approval through IREC, because we are friendly to our researchers, and it's our goal to make life as easy as possible for the researchers, so they can get on and do the things which they're good at, which is research. Whereas if you make a mistake in your protocol and you submit it to an external research ethics committee or internal review board, or whatever name is that body has, it will be your research will not be approved, and you will have to start all over, and possibly not be eligible for doing that type of research, and you will be a long way from home. So it certainly makes sense, even in those cases where you really need to have an external review by an independent locally registered body to get that kind of research cleared by CIMMYT's IREC first. I hope that answers the multiple questions that were embedded in this one.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. There is one more question. What about software that automatically scrambles PII and only authorized people so that they are available to scramble again? Is that feasible?
Sure. I mean, as long as it's very clear what is being done and how it's being what is being done in that, and it's part of the research protocol, that can be used for blurring geospatial coordinates. This is, absolutely that. There are procedures in place. One of the ways to do that is, so there's two major ways to blur. One is by either truncating or averaging for instance, 2 decimal places. If 2 decimal places is the relevant level of coarseness for your geospatial information, for using it in publications and open access data. The other one is by adding noise to it at that same kind of at that same level that would lead to the data no longer pointing to households, but to a random location in the vicinity that could mean that it could belong to any of a multitude of households in that area, and it really depends on what you want and what you like, what you choose. Some people have a preference for one and one for the other.
Thank you. There is one more question here about verbal consent. Is verbal consent enough to prove, or are there special cases where one needs a written consent from farmers involved in data collection or pictures taken?
Yeah, okay. This is context specific. It depends on part on what local legislation says. It's also depends on the type of research that we're doing. And the way that in the local context people look at giving verbal or written consent. In some cultures, signing a consent form is a huge deal, which people would never do. I mean, signing your name to something that's not something that you do. Whereas providing the verbal consent is something which they will do, and they see as something which is well described. What we do in those cases is that we prefer if there is a witness to giving the verbal consent, that it's not just one person, but it's but it is something that is context specific. It's also specific to the type of research that you do. If it's low risk research, then we're much less picky about the way that the consent is obtained, whether it's written or verbal. Whereas if there is more risk involved in the research, then we really need to look into that issue of how the consent is obtained and how it is recorded. Becomes much more important.
Thank you, Gideon. We have one more question, but also we are also running time, but maybe I can read the comments that also we have collected from the audience. For example, from our colleagues, Motalev. Gideon, you may organize a 1-hour training for the IRB members. This is, you could organize several training hours to several groups of scientists.
Yep.
Also, we have a comment from Dr. Martin Croft. Dear Gideon, thanks for a good presentation, a very important topic. Many scientists need to know more about this, not just the social scientists. Let's all scale to 1 CG. So maybe.
There is nothing that I can add to that. That's absolutely correct, and that's exactly the reason why we decided to give this webinar now, because it is so important. And anyway, if people have questions, feel free to reach out. and pose your questions. If there is something that is very specific to your research that you have a question about with regard to any ethical considerations thereof, or if you have a question about it, feel free to reach out. We will address it. We're there to help the research process and not to hinder it.
Thank you very much. So I would like to, we have run out of time. So this presentation will be at the CIMMYT webcast. And also, as Gideon said, you can contact him or you can contact any member of the team for further questions or training sessions or any clearance that you would like to have. I would like to thank Dr. Gideon Kruseman for this presentation, this seminar, Research Ethics Compliance, Why, Who, and How. So thank you very much, Gideon, for your wonderful presentation. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. And it was great to be able to do that.
Thanks, Gideon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye, everyone.
Stay well.